Hi, you guys can hear me? Not too loud? Good. This is my talk about building an application installer from the ground up. We've wanted to do application installers for a long, long time, and what we did with GNOME Package Kit and over the last few years isn't really what we wanted to do. So we sort of took a step back and worked out what do we need to provide, what do we need to do, what's the use case, what are we trying to solve? So this talk's basically about some of the infrastructure we put together so we could do what we wanted to do. First things first, who am I, why should you listen? I'm Richard Hughes, I've worked in open source for about 10 years. I've worked for Red Hat for about 6 of those, I think. I maintain Package Kit, UPower, ColorD, GNOME Color Manager, GNOME Power Manager, some bits of GNOME Settings Daemon, some bits of GNOME Control Center, and of course GNOME Software and the libupstream stuff upstream. So I've been doing this stuff for a little while, and we've over the years tried many different things, and this is kind of what we're settling on. This talk does get very technical very quickly. I figured the audience you can cope with XML and stuff, but if you have got any questions that I haven't answered in a few slides, either yell at the end or you interrupt me, whatever, I don't care. So if you go right back to the start, rewind 5 years ago, what is an application? So you might think, oh, it's easy, it's a package. But some packages are, an application might be made up of multiple packages, or an application, they might have multiple applications in a single package. Some applications might share libraries. Other things might come into the mix, like as an application that's not shown in the menus, an application. And we need to add other things that aren't applications into the model as well. But rewind 5 years ago, we came to the conclusion that anything with a desktop file that doesn't have no display true is an application. Now that gets us maybe 5% of the way. A desktop file is kind of useful. It gives us lots of useful information, things like an application name, which may or may not be translated. It gives us a one-line summary, mostly on GNOME, mostly not on KDE with exceptions. And it also gives us some interesting metadata, like what group should the application be shown in, and other things what project might the upstream be linked with. We don't actually get that much info. You certainly can't build a comprehensive, cohesive app store with the kind of information you have from a desktop file. Ubuntu tried to fix this by pushing long descriptions and things into desktop files and other bits of app store specific metadata. And we looked at that and we kind of said, you can't put formatted, multi-line, localized descriptions in a INI file format. It just doesn't work. You can't do lists and unordered lists, paragraphs, that kind of rich text that you might want in a description. It's very difficult to do screenshots. So a screenshot might want a localized caption with, say, 5 screenshots of an application. And that without using horrific hacks like semicolons and colons and stuff to try and break up the data in a single 2,000-line desktop file doesn't really work. So we came up with this thing called app data. Now, this is a very, very small XML format. You can see we're linking with the main desktop file. We've also able to override things like the name. So why do we want to do that? If it's already in the desktop file for GNOME Calculator might have calculator. The desktop file for XFCE calculator has calculator, and the name in the KDE calculator is calculator. It's not terribly useful, and we showed all 3 in the software center next to each other. The user doesn't know which one to pick and gets confused when one doesn't match the rest of their desktop.
The KDE calculator actually has name equals kcalc and generic name equals calculator as it's supposed to be according to the desktop file entry specification.
So The question was basically, there is a generic name for desktop files, which some apps in KDE do use. My response to that would be most apps don't use that, or if they do use that, they abuse that. So with this, we've provided a way to kind of override the desktop name. So you might want to show one name, like calculator, in the menus, but you might want to show KDE calculator or GNOME calculator in the software center. We might want to say GNOME photos rather than just photos. So it's a way of overriding it. Of course, you can localize this using something like IntelTool, where you just do _name rather than name, and then use normal pop files. Similarly, you can override the one-line description, that may be less common, and more importantly, you can have a long description. Now, don't copy this format. I've like squashed it down to fit in a slide, make it at least legible. But descriptions have to have a long content. You maybe need 2 or 3 paragraphs, maybe with a list, proper English prose, which is translated. If it's not translated, it's kind of useless, because the majority of the users of this high-level tool won't speak English, and so it's pointless to say just use a package description because they're not localized, and also there's only one for applications maybe shared. There's also screenshots, now not shown here, but you can also put captions, localized captions on the screenshots as well. What I didn't say earlier was this file belongs upstream. We don't want to be doing this for each distribution. Upstream is the person that's translating their desktop file, so upstream should be the person that's translating this file. When upstream changes their UI or changes toolkits or adds features, they're the ones that can trivially retake their screenshots rather than us taking them in the distro level and then after a few months them being obsolete and old. So I think in the last 13 months, I think I've emailed 400 upstream maintainers and opened up 300 upstream bugs asking people to ship these files to a limited degree of success, which I'll cover in a minute. Other interesting things, the homepage link is obviously, that's dead obvious, but we're also introducing other URL types in the future. Things like a donation URL, which is interesting to people that are maybe not part of the core GNOME platform. Other things like user help pages for KDE and that kind of thing. But we don't show a lot of that in the UI at the moment, that's for the future. Which kind of brings me on to the update contact. In contacting hundreds of upstream projects using unbelievable different types of bug tracking software like Mantis, maybe 30 different Bugzilla instances, Launchpad, etc., it's really hard to contact the upstream maintainers. And so upstream just puts a link here and says, look, this is my upstream email address. If you want me to change something in the file, email me directly. That means when I say, okay, we now have a donation URL facility in the software center, I can email 500 people, get updates within a few months, and then they get to use this new feature really quickly. I don't intend on using this every day. I think people might get quite annoyed if I email them quite a lot, so maybe once, maybe twice a year. Other, maybe less interesting things which we can discover from the desktop file is we can override the group. So it might be on a GNOME software. I might want to be showing GNOME applications above in the search results, above KDE applications. Or if I run GNOME software on XFCE, I want to prefer XFCE applications over GNOME applications. So it's quite a simple format. There's better examples if you just type app data into Google, but this is kind of like a bare framework. This is when we started to realize that having an app being a desktop file doesn't work super well, because some things are system-wide resources that you might want to install like an application. Something like a GStreamer codec is something that you install system-wide that the user's quite familiar with installing. Or a font. Fonts are typically installed system-wide. Or an input method. Input methods are really important to get into the UI because, like I said, a lot of people don't speak English, don't type English. So we modified the spec to say an application is a desktop file unless it's something else. And we've got kind of like a few examples, and I'll come more to that in a minute. Fast forward another 6 months. Lots of people coming to us and said, look, I can now install things like gedit and Eclipse, and they're not very good unless you install other stuff, like add-ons to the application. So it's not a system-wide thing, It's like an extra piece of the puzzle for an application. For instance, gedit on its own is kind of dull, but if you install the code completion stuff and spell checkers and that kind of thing, it becomes a really proficient editor. So we made these things called meta-info files, yet another format, but I'll come to that. So meta-info files are very similar to an app data file, and you can see the same sort of thing localizable in the same way. There's also a metadata license, so rather than us inferring different information about what license the package description will be under, or the upstream description will be under, we can now say, okay, well explicitly it's CC0, therefore we can use it in some of the web tools that we're using, we can reuse it for X, Y, Z, lots of random reasons. Any of the SPX IDs are fine as content licenses. We also have a project license, so for applications not clear in the RPM, we can fall back to the RPM license field, but it's better to have an SPX ID because then we can show the user a clickable link with like a high-level description of actually what GPL v3 means and why it's different to GPL v2. It's more interesting to the user than just a random string. And again, an update contact. Now, I think so far in Fedora, there's about 20 or 30 of these in Fedora 21, so things like gedit and Eclipse is really useful. And I hope more and more people will adopt this upstream. Yeah, that's all I want to say about that. It gets more complicated. So, we've got this nice data. Let's assume that all the upstream software is now providing these app data and meta-info files for all their software. What do we actually do with it? Well, when we have the build server or our local desktop and we download the Fedora archive, we've got a few gig of RPM files in basically a folder. What we need to do is go through those individual folders, go through the packages in the folder, and any that look interesting, i.e. that contain app data files, meta-info files, desktop files, or GStreamer codecs, explode them into a temporary directory, and then run some stuff to kind of get some data off them. And then we generate a couple of extra files that we can ship with the other metadata. Now at the moment, we don't ship this on the build server. That's the medium-term goal. At the moment, I build this stuff on my server at home, and then once a week we upload the tarballs in a package, and they get pushed out to Fedora. This is the plan. Now, this extra metadata, along with the existing metadata, is consumed by PackageKit. So PackageKit's downloading their stuff using librepo and all that kind of goodness. And this is then in turn being used by GNOME software. A lot of people assume that GNOME software is kind of like a front end to PackageKit, but it's really just one of the things that GNOME software can do. And GNOME software can also talk to things like Epiphany, so you can install Twitter as a web app, which is basically using Epiphany in like a Chromeless mode. And there's quite a few different web apps that we're shipping for Fedora 21. Another thing that people said they want from a software center is the ability to tag and rate applications. So I might want to say GIMP is freaking awesome, Inkscape works well with GIMP, but I have different comments. We haven't actually done any comments server for Fedora 21 as it gets kind of legal and kind of complicated. But we have got ratings ready for Fedora 21, and preliminarily some of the usage stuff is kind of at the moment turned off by default, but maybe. That's kind of like from a metadata server side. And then an implementation point of view, we have GNOME software, just basically really has a big array of these application things. And I kind of simplified it right down here, but each application has different attributes. And the application might have been created from PackageKit packages, or they might have been created from Epiphany virtual web apps, or they might be something else. There's this thing, plugin structure. So at the moment we use the plugins to say things like, is this application installed? And if it's a package source, then we can ask PackageKit and say, yeah, can you do RPM and see if it's installed? Or if it's something like Glick, we can sort of say, okay, we'll install this rather than install an RPM package. But to the user, it's just kind of an abstraction. They don't care. We could switch out PackageKit to something else anytime. AppStream is kind of like one of the more core modules where we actually need this extra data before stuff's installed. But again, you could switch it out if you really wanted to. The plugin API is kind of private and internal, but there's nothing to stop crazy people writing internal plugins. Go on.
So what if one application is available in multiple, well, repositories or streams?
So yeah, that's a good question. So that's really hard to solve. So for instance, the question was what happens if there's something like GIMP available as a Glick bundle and also as a package? And it's really hard. So at some point we need to put some policy in saying prefer the distro, or if users explicitly said they want this exact bundle, they probably want to use that bundle for that package, for that application from that point on. So it's unsolved, but I think mixing and matching things like bundles and packages is going to be a pain, but I think we need to be able to use one or both. You see what I mean? It's a necessary evil, I think. Yeah. Yeah. So I kind of was quite hand-wavy about what we did when we exploded the RPM. When you've got a binary RPM, something like GIMP, GIMP might also have another sub-package like GIMP-data, which might be the thing that contains all the translations or all the icons that we want to use. And so when we actually decompress files on the build server, we actually have to decompress other stuff that the package also depends on from the same source RPM. It's like a poor man's mock. You don't want to install the entire tree as if you were going to sort of install the package, but you do want enough of the extra packages so you get the data. So certain packages are whitelisted. So for a lot of KDE apps, there's the Oxygen icon theme also gets pulled in, GNOME, high color, etc. So there's a few kind of like quirky rules. But you can see generally the whole of running metadata rebuild on the whole of Fedora takes about 20 minutes, saturating 4 cores at 100% with 100% SATA. It's pretty mad. It's a nice way of warming up a room. But it takes about sort of 20 minutes to go through. Just expanding out about what processing is. Processing on each exploded, when we explode the RPMs themselves, we only explode the files that look interesting. There's no point in still decompressing a gigabyte worth of texture data. So we just have a few plugins that run out and that tell the decompressor which files to decompress. So Absorb is a more technical plugin, which something like, a good example, something like a photo viewer application might have an import application that's technically, it passes all the checks to be an application, but really it's just another way of launching the main app. And so we write a little rule and write a little tiny app data file locally, which basically says merge the helper application into the application itself. So we only show one entry in the software center rather than two. Otherwise it'd be kind of confusing to remove the helper application, and also the other one then disappears, you won't get one back and the other one reappears. It's kind of confusing if you have too many apps in one package. So absorbing just takes the data from the helper and keeps things like the keywords and URLs, stuff like that. App data obviously reads the app data file, nothing crazy there. Blacklist is a hard-coded list of apps that aren't apps. So sometimes in Fedora we have packages that package up a command line tool and think, oh, we'll make this easy to access. So they write a desktop file that has an exact line of sh something and then the command. They're not really apps. They're not GUI apps. They kind of just sneak under the radar. So we blacklist those. Something which we don't use yet is in the upstream spec, there's a requirement so that we report in the metadata which DBus interfaces application provides, which is quite useful to query, I guess, sometimes. And so we just read the .service files system and session-wide. Desktop files predictably reads the desktop file. Fonts kind of interesting. So we treat fonts as kind of font applications. They get installed system-wide. The font plugin actually generates things like an icon for the font, which is typically just the uppercase A underscore A, unless it's got no English page table, where we use something like Hebrew font or something. It also generates a screenshot, which seems odd again for a font, but it's basically like the quick lazy dog jumps over the fox, whatever it is. And obviously use something applicable if it's Sanskrit or something. But it kind of works. getText is a really kind of a hacky metric. Some applications aren't particularly useful. If I just speak French, I have no knowledge of English, I prefer to have applications in the search box up near the top that are localized in my language. So we need to go through the MO files and use a kind of a metric to say which of these languages has above 80%, say, translation. So if I only speak French and I'm running in a French locale, I can prefer applications that are otherwise similar in the search results. GIR, as the name suggests, is opening GIR introspection files, looking for things like integration points in the desktop, things like whether they have a status menu or things, schoolboy, things where they have an integration point or something, something like maybe not so much a status item, but whether they have like a shell search thing, whether they have a notification support, that kind of thing. GResource, again, is looking for the more GNOME-3 applications that don't actually have any API we can check to see whether they display a status icon, that kind of thing, so we can penalize or sort of suggest apps based on that. GStreamer, much like Font, goes through the GStreamer plugins themselves and tries to generate an application for each package. And it's a fudge that we can't install the codecs individually, so we package them up and we kind of say this plugin provides, say, MP3, OGG, etc. And it'll make a list dynamically rather than hard coding it all. Hard-coded is fixing stuff that's broken. So when we've basically said to upstream, you've included categories that aren't valid categories, or you've put things in music when you should have put them in art, etc. So it's fixing up stuff that's broken. Long-term, all the hard-coded stuff should disappear. We've had lots of upstream releases, although some stuff upstream is kind of dead. We've got this policy which is kind of controversial, where if anything hasn't had an upstream release in 5 years, it requires an app data file before we'll even include it in the metadata. So it's kind of controversial in that there are some old but loved applications, and my argument for that would be if you care about them that much, stick an app data file in the SRPM if there is going to be no more upstream releases. iBus predictably is going through the input methods and looking for what languages they will support. So if someone's running a French locale, we can say, for example, a Chinese locale, we can provide them with input methods and search results which are more suitable than others. KDE ones are basically doing the same as the GNOME ones, so rather than using things like GNOME introspection, we can find out the integration points, meta-info, as the name suggests, meta-info, and finally probably the cracktastic one here is we actually run NM on the binaries to look for kind of interesting stuff that show an application is embed well with the desktop. So if I sort of expand a little bit more about what I mean by kudos and how they integrate with the desktop. When we rate apps and we know nothing about the app, we really want to know how well is this application, is it maintained? Is it integrating well with my desktop? Is it going to have the same kind of toolkit that I'm used to? Does it exist in my language? And so this thing called Kudo was kind of shared between all distros, where, for instance, having a search provider in your application, things like Gnote or whatever would do, or now GNOME software, would actually give you an extra star. So think of the kudos as an extra star in GNOME software. On top of these that I've listed here, there's also other kudos which are layered on top, things that we have to know at the session time. So only when we run the software application can we know the user's locale. And so then we can add an extra sort of session level exists in my language kudo, which gives them another star or further up in the search rankings. And we can also do things like, has this application had a recent release? i.e., has it been released in the last year or 18 months? If it has, we give it an extra star. If it hasn't, it gets showed lower down in search results. So even without lots of users saying, this app's awesome, and this app's rubbish, we can give quite an accurate, how good is this app, based on the integration. So, kind of controversial. So we do all this stuff, we spend 20 minutes saturating 4 cores, we do all this crazy, crazy stuff on the metadata. 3 files pop out, not very big files at that. So there's 1.5 meg of compressed XML, just with the app stream data in itself. I'll give an example of in a minute. There's 6 megs of 64 by 64 icons. Also, another requirement I forgot to mention, for applications to be installed, they need to ship at least 1 icon that's at or above 48 by 48, which seems a little arbitrary, but 48 by 48 padded into a 64 by 64 box kind of still looks okay. But if you've got a 64 by 64 box and you're doing a 16 by 16 icon padding out, it's just a big white box. So we kind of think the minimum we require is 48 pixels. I don't think it's a big ask to ask upstreams for that. There's also a third file, which is all the upstream data that we generated, but where the application didn't quite make the grade. For instance, if it was last released 10 years ago, or if the icon's tiny, or if it's done other crazy things, it gets stuck in this extra metadata file. And this we use for the web interface. So if you're an upstream or downstream maintainer, you can say, okay, well, what is wrong with the app? Why isn't it listed in the software center, either for KDE or for GNOME? And you can kind of see what it would have looked like if you'd fixed different issues. So it's kind of useful. We wouldn't obviously upload it to the Fedora infrastructure, but it's more useful for people wanting to know either what their app is going to look like or why their app isn't included. This is what the XML looks like itself. It's dead simple. And for the few thousand apps that we have in Fedora, I think uncompressed, it's like 9 megs of XML, which we can pass in like 130 milliseconds. So we're really just passing it in startup for GNOME software, and the app launch is like that. It's really quick. Yeah, don't look at some of the finer points. I did French at school, but not that well. So we've got these XML schemas and like meta info, app data, app stream, all these like random XML, all these arbitrary rules. So we've put quite a lot of time into the validating side of things. So you can see here I'm validating a file that is basically hand-coded to be the worst possible app data file in existence. And you can see there's lots of style warnings. For instance, list elements have to end, can't end in a full stop in a locale equals C. Summaries can't end in dot. Name can't end in dot. The summary can't be longer than the name. The summary has to be longer than the name. And also lots of like attribute things like a good example. For instance, when there's no copyright on the file, where there's no license, etc. So we kind of check all that stuff. And there's also validate dash relax, which is kind of like just warn me about the serious stuff, don't worry about like punctuation and stuff. And there's also validate dash strict, which is kind of full anal mode kind of retentiveness. But it's a good thing. It's now I proposed it to be in the Fedora package guidelines, where applications that ship app data files have to have them validated. Which is kind of a fairly obvious step if we want some high quality data. So where are we with adoption? App data was kind of conceived maybe like 5 years ago, and SUSE had been doing it ever since. Fedora kind of picked it up and then went cold, and then we've picked it up again in the last year or so. And I think in the last year we've kind of accelerated. I think we're the only distro now that ships the latest version of metadata in the distro. SUSE also shipped the data, but a much older version. They don't have like the kudos stuff and the integration bits. Debian is working this year on a Google Summer of Code project to generate upstream metadata from their packages. They're doing it not using XML, they want to use YAML because Debian. So it's basically going to be a trivial conversion from YAML to XML and then load it. But it's kind of good that they're doing it in the same kind of way. Interestingly, I had heard nothing, like absolute radio silence from Canonical about Ubuntu. And then maybe just before this presentation was written, a guy came and said, look, here's a patch for GNOME software because this doesn't work on Ubuntu. I was like, wow, that's like the first time they've broken radio silence. So maybe in the future, that doesn't bother me too much whether they use it. It would be good if we all used at least the same metadata format, because it's crazy to keep reinventing the wheel. Also, if Debian's YAML experiment doesn't go particularly well, it might be they end up using the upstream stuff that we use. And there's some talk from like the Arch people who want to use exactly the same tools that Fedora's using. Arch was doing really well, and then the guy who was doing all the code got married and fell off the planet. So I kind of hope that when he gets back, he can carry on. But yeah, so there is nothing else in the distro land that kind of competes with this right now. I guess it's a good time to mention, sometimes maintainers get this wrong. So upstream, most of the time, does what you say. You say, can I have a 16 by 9 aspect screenshot showing your application? And they give you something that's tall and thin and using Comic Sans, maybe with some really, really inappropriate background. And sometimes we have to override that. So Mo and Ryan have been working recently. Some of the apps that we really care about that have to look good, things like Firefox, maybe aren't too fussed about what it looks like on Fedora. We're actually taking screenshots and overriding the upstream ones just so they look awesome. Similarly, some applications that we kind of care about, like a few of the games that maybe were finished 5 years ago, we've written app data, or Ryan mostly has written app data files for these programs, so they look good in Software Center. There's actually an initiative if you're one of these like badge people that want a badge. Ryan and I have been running this thing where you can like crowdsource descriptions, and just check out my blog if you want the links and stuff. Basically, where you can contribute app data files for kind of lost applications and get a badge, like a virtual badge, not an actual badge. So what does this let us do? This is the front page of GNOME Software, first tab, which is basically a search and kind of overview type tab. So you can see there's a big featured banner, which is usually a hard-coded list of kind of awesome apps that we want to showcase with high-quality metadata and well integrated into the platform. There's also picks. Now, picks for GNOME 20, for Fedora 20 and GNOME 3.10 were just a hard-coded list. There's like 7 things, and there's like 5 would show, so it's kind of a pretty boring list. Now we're using some clever algorithms where if you've installed GIMP, it's probably likely you're also quite interested in Inkscape, and so we think, okay, if you've got an application installed in a group where there are other applications that have a suitable level of integration and screenshots, we also then show them here. Kalev, just dead recently, has done recommended games, which is the same sort of thing, but specifically for games. A lot of people seem to be kind of more into the games than other stuff. It could be in the future we don't do recommended games, and if you have lots of Office software installed, we could do recommended Office software. This one's more up in the air, but it'll look something similar for this, for Fedora 21. You see the stars. Also, incidentally, if you don't like the star rating we've given it, if you actually do think that music is like beyond awesome, it's like 5.5 stars, you can just click the stars and that will give it your own user rating, which will get propagated back up to Fedora Tagger, which means that in the future maybe we can use that information for saying, okay, well, let's feature this app if more people actually love it. And if you go for it.
How does it track what I've given?
Crack, explain?
The track that I've given. I mean, I could obviously, like, an hour later, like, rate it again.
Oh, sure. So if you do rate it again, it is anonymous, so it would count as 2 people rating it. But if you, the question was basically, what if you change your mind? So we store it locally.
No, actually, you cheat.
Oh, so if you're like a KDE guy and you want to downrate all the GNOME apps, because we're not using we're not using user stats by default. We use the integration points, which I think is a more sane way of doing it. That wouldn't matter. That hasn't happened yet, although don't give anyone in particular any ideas. So yeah, I'll come to the account stuff in a minute, but yeah, this is the basic. So at the 3 tabs, this is the one where people would see it first. If you also scroll down, there's also like a category search. So if you know you're looking for some sort of word processing software, but you're not sure which one, you do a category search there. So this shows you the installed software along with some removed ones. Kind of controversially, in GNOME we kind of stop people removing core apps like GNOME Calculator, that kind of really low-level stuff like Yelp that we kind of expect to be there all the time. You can still do it using the command line, either DNF or RPM, whatever, or RPM dash, whatever. But here we allow the user to uninstall stuff that isn't going to break their system if it disappears. This is using the long descriptions, the other AppStream or app data files if you have them available. So another thing is if you have a distro where you don't have AppStream metadata, but you do have app data installed descriptions, this will look just the same for distros that do and don't have the metadata. So it sort of lets GNOME software work on distros that haven't quite got the level of integration that Fedora, SUSE, and a few others have. And an update screen. This is the only time I think that we show packages. So ordinarily you'd see like a long list of things that are applications. So we only show applications in the main view, things like the Vim GTK thing, and some add-ons and stuff. Sometimes there's a big list, but 90% of the updates you download will be OS updates, i.e. things that aren't actually apps. So we kind of clump them all here. This is where you can also look at their update text. Slightly differently to how GNOME PackageKit works, you can't install the updates one by one. This is all done offline. So we only show the updates where we've downloaded the packages, metadata is up to date, it's all dep solved, ready to go. If you click the restart install button, it will literally go down, it will not fail. Unlike F20 where it could fail. Now, updating is not something you want to fail, so it's kind of good that we've got the whole librepo infrastructure in place, so we can make this stuff really work. So far. The details view, if you actually click on an application that looks interesting, by default we'll show like a big screenshot or even bigger screenshot if there's no other thumbnails. Thumbnails on the right hand side. These screenshots are actually mirrored on alt.fedoraproject.org rather than going to the upstream website itself. I guess kind of a few reasons. Main one being privacy. You don't want the upstream website to know that you're about to install their software for maybe privacy or security reasons. Upstream might be having a 24 hours downtime and the screenshot's not available, which would suck. And also we want to override some screenshots rather than let upstream do like goats images and stuff. You can see the long description there. I'm kind of encouraging people not to use bullet points and use prose where possible, so we can have like a cohesive kind of experience. It's pointless having all applications with screenshots with different aspect ratios and different length descriptions, and the UI would just flow really badly. And there's also some details. I guess most notable there is the license. You can click on it and get like a comprehensive overview of what actually that means, rather than being just a random string for geeks. Version number of what you're installing. It will give you information on when you last updated it. Similarly, if you click history and the application is installed, it will show you when it was installed, when it was updated, when you removed it, etc. Which is useful if it stops working suddenly and you want to find out actually could it have been an update or what was actually done to it. This is probably where we'll do something with the donation feature as well. Sorry, question?
It'll be fine, you can always identify one license for the application. I'm thinking the code base could be made up of multiple licenses.
So yeah, that's a good question. So actually if you do that, the way it's implemented right now is if you said it's GPL v2+, GPL v3, MPL or CPL, it will pass that in a proper way, so each individual thing like MPL, CPL, EUPL, whatever, will all be hyperlinked differently. If it gets to a license that we don't recognize, we just leave it as the text. you know, so you can have like brackets and you can have and, or, etc. and it just kind of works. Does that answer the question?
Just follow up. So the metadata file, would you put in multiple project license tags?
No, you do it like the Fedora does. You have like a good question. The question was, would you have multiple project licenses? And I guess that's kind of a more XML-y way of doing it. But what you can't do with this is doing something like GPL v2+ or CPL and MPL. You need to kind of like a more like an expression rather than or. You know what I mean? So at the moment we just have a free text string. If you format like Fedora, will come out nice. Incidentally, we're not using the Fedora license enumerations. We're using the SPX ID kind of like shared between all the different distros. No other reason than SUSE and Debian are already using them. So it didn't make sense to sort of enforce Fedora ones.
And the rest of the industry as well.
Yeah, sure, exactly, yes. Fedora kind of led the way with the whole like sorting out the licensing issues for a lot of projects, and now something else is kind of more standard. Another thing that's interesting is the size. We don't actually just take the size of the executable. So for something like OpenArena, the actual package for OpenArena is like 2 megabytes or something, but that requires OpenArena -data and language shared data, etc., which adds up to 400 meg. So it's more important to show the user what is it actually going to require to install on your system rather than the application itself, which would kind of be disingenuous to show 2 megabytes. Other things, this is what the meta-info files let us do. So meta-info files, for Eclipse, for instance, if you scroll right down past all the buttons and the labels, can very easily click, 3 add-ons to Eclipse installed. Same for gedit and a few more apps that we're waiting for upstream releases for. As usual, a lot of this stuff is still upstream, so in Fedora we're waiting for tarballs before we can build packages, before we can extract metadata for. But I'm kind of hopeful by Fedora 21, probably beta time, we'll have tons of apps that are using this mechanism, and a lot more apps that are using app data. Question?
Is this the only place that add-ons are shown, or are they showing the regular search results as well? Can you search just for add-ons?
So, good question. So the question was if you search for something like development tools, would they show up? Yes, they would. They wouldn't show up as a first-level, high-level app, but if you search for tooling required for quotations, it would bring up Eclipse, which would then have this at the bottom. So if you add keywords to the meta-info file, they will get added to their parent application. So which is it's like something like a spell check. If you have gedit, you type in spell check, it will bring up gedit. Even though gedit has no concept of what spell checker is, it'll bring it up because it has an add-on that allows you to do spell checking. Make sense?
Yeah.
Awesome. You look more convinced than I thought you'd be. So other things, like these are the things that aren't typical apps. So here we have the GStreamer codecs. This kind of works. It's slightly more controversial for Fedora because for various different reasons we can't show things like the MP3 codec. So if you actually do search for MP3, there's no screenshot for this, but if you did search for MP3, it would return a result and you could click on it and it would take you to the Fedora wiki explaining why maybe you shouldn't be using MP3, but if you really have to, this is what you do. So it's like a layer of indirection that we kind of had to put in for kind of legalish / policy reasons. And it might be something how we, if you search for something like Steam, that's one of the top requests is I searched for Steam and nothing came up. So we might be able to say, okay, well, here's a search result, here's the icon, here's some screenshots, but we can't install this for you, but here's how, type thing. So it's kind of an ongoing, more political, legally thing. Go for it, question.
If you have the supplementary repositories installed on your system,
Yep.
will it then show up?
So the question was if you had something like the repository that cannot be named installed in your system, would it show up? So for Fedora 20, no, it wouldn't show up at all. Fedora 21, a few, should we say, well-known repositories are adding this data or in the process of adding this data. And I think for 20 they'll do something like they did for Fedora, where you have like a Fedora-appstream-data package, which installs those two tarballs in a known place. In which case, yes, it will. But we can't install them by default for lots of legal / policy / crazy reasons. Does that answer the question? Cool. Also fonts, this is the example of the font icons I was talking about. What we had to do with fonts was do a lot of decrazying. Fonts are kind of crazy. The more you look at fonts, the more you kind of not want to look at fonts. Where you want to collect them into families and you want to make the metadata a bit more sane. So this is actually using like long descriptions for families and this kind of thing. So it kind of works. Fedora 21 is much more comprehensive than Fedora 20 was for add-ons. And of course input sources, which are kind of hugely important if you don't type English on a keyboard, which kind of just work impressively well for something that was kind of hacked in fairly quickly. Now, I mentioned this search provider. Because we have this rich data, we have this data available that's been super quick. GNOME software, even when you close it down, is kind of still running in the background with a few megs of data sort of sitting in hot cache. So if I go to the dashboard and I type in tux, I don't have anything installed that matches this. And so GNOME Shell goes to all the search providers and says, can you match tux? And GNOME software comes back with 3 items. Click that item, it shows you the details page with the screenshots and details. 1 button, install, you have it, you can launch it. It's super quick. I use this like 2 or 3 times a week. It's awesome. Works much better in F20 than in F21 than in the Copper. It's awesome. This is more stuff that we want to do in the future. This is kind of where it gets a bit kind of hand-wavy. The current codec installation procedure, when you actually like someone sends you an MP3 file, you double-click and you don't have the codecs installed, it's kind of modal, kind of clunky, kind of doesn't really fit into the UX and UI that we want to design. So we want to do it so that as soon as you import that MP3 onto your file system in, say, music or in Rhythmbox or whatever, it will actually request the codecs ahead of time. So rather than going to a conference, sitting in a hotel room, trying to play the movie, and can't because there's no codecs and no internet, we actually know that ahead of time, and we can kind of do it the UX in a much more planned and kind of methodical way. And fingers crossed Khaled will make this work next cycle. No pressure. But yeah, this is kind of the hand-wavy future. And then even more controversially, we really want to integrate like a fast type account system into GNOME much more heavily. So a good use case for software might be, I install my laptop, I install XChat, I install GIMP and Inkscape. I use them quite happily. 6 months' time, I reload my PC. Next time I log in, it'll say, you've installed all these apps before on exactly the same machine. Do you want to just install all the same apps that you did before? Which is kind of like a kind of nice use case for a developer. But it also allows us to see which users are using which apps, which is quite useful for a statistics point of view. So you can say, okay, well, this person is likely to be an artist. They have MyPaint installed and GIMP. Therefore, if someone installs GIMP, also suggest MyPaint. So rather than using like a really clunky algorithm, we can sort of do an Amazon and kind of get some high quality data. But this is kind of hand-wavy future. This may or may not happen for 3.14. Maybe. So how are we doing? AppStream and AppData. AppStream's been around for about 3 or 4 years now. AppData's been around since I think November last year, and I've been lobbying Upstream and lobbying different distros and stuff. And I think this morning we hit, I think it was like 36-point-something% of all the applications across Fedora. So it's what, 382 high-quality apps with long descriptions. 331 with screenshots. Now that's quite a small number, but if you take into account all the upstream software that have already added this stuff, and we are waiting for an upstream release. So in 6 months' time, these figures should be much more awesome. Don't read too much into the whole GNOME KDE adoption thing. GNOME had a goal where all their core applications had to have AppData about 3 or 4 months ago. Which meant that they artificially hire. Also, KDE apps don't typically have a comment, the one-line summary, which means a lot of them get blacklisted because we can't even show any bare bones about them in the software center. So don't read too much into that.
KDE upstream is now adding upstream metadata in the 4.14 applications release that is now in, I think, release candidate status or
Yeah.
something like that.
So Kevin's right. Basically, yeah, KDE Upstream is basically fully behind this as well, just as much as GNOME is, where they're now upstream applications are adding these files like crazy. In fact, I think KDE is accelerating on GNOME, so in a horrific future, it could be that KDE is actually winning, so we have to then do another initiative back. So that's kind of, it's a good thing, it's no bad thing at all. And Ryan's been super busy, Mo's been super busy, and all the contributors for their programs have helped loads as well. So I mentioned this web interface. It's unreadable URL, but it's alt.fedoraproject.org/pub/screenshots. And you can see basically an entire huge HTML page showing every single app we show in the Software Center. What is it actually going to look like? Because you don't want to stay to upstream software, you have to install the latest Fedora Rawhide to see what your app's going to look like in the Software Center. So this is like a really quick online version that we can say to upstream, this is what it's going to look like. And this is after it's had all the kudos and things added to it, so you can see if the process is working. It's more useful to see the failed page where you can see why an application isn't included. For instance, if it's dead forever, or if it's a tiny icon. And I guess lastly is questions. This stuff's been rumbling around for ages, and you can literally question me on anything. So thank you for listening, and any questions? Go for it.
What do you, so I assume you get a lot of, so this is not the typical package manager, right? So you can't install all the packages. Like, do you get a lot of requests for doing that?
So how do you mean installing everything?
No. Like, okay, so any other, like, the whole package kits, it's like, you can install everything. Right?
So
do you get a lot of requests for
a package view?
doing that?
I reckon I get one every 2 weeks where someone says, I can't find PowerTop, or how do I install say RPM lint or GCC using GNOME software? I'm kind of the opinion that this tool's not designed for that person. If you're on the command line using GCC or using Bash or whatever, you're probably not the target user for this. The target user for this bit of software shouldn't ever have to use a terminal. You know, if they're using a terminal, we kind of failed. But people do open bugs basically saying, can we have a package view? And if we did that, it would look like GNOME Package Kit used to, which was a giant mess. So you'd type in, Office for an Office application, and you'd get 3,500 results back, which isn't terribly useful, mostly with English descriptions and random package names, no icons, etc. So I think it's good that we've got this tool for the high level, either I don't know or I don't care users. I put myself in the I don't care section, you know. Sometimes I can't remember the package name for stuff I shouldn't have to, you know. And I'm kind of saying to people, if you're using the terminal for something like PowerTop, you can use the terminal to type in DNF install PowerTop, which is sometimes not liked. Anyone else? Go for it.
So why are I've noticed that you're enforcing some policy decisions that are really package kit policies at metadata generation time, like do not show applications that are command line applications wrapped in a terminal, or do not show applications that use like Qt3 or GTK1 or some other strange toolkit, or do not show applications that have too small icons. And why are you doing this? Because in this case you're enforcing your policy decisions on all the other applications that want to use the metadata.
So the question was basically, I'll sort of summarize quickly, why am I doing policy decisions in the builder? Why am I kind of leaving out applications which users might want to use? And I think at the moment it's the only way we can do it, to have an awesome app. We could build an awesome app with all this extra stuff and have applications with tiny icons that are padded out into big white squares, but it would look kind of rubbish, you know? If we want to do a high quality app installer, we have to say, if you play by the bare minimum rules, so all they have to do is ship an icon of bigger than that, they have to ship a one-line description and an application name. That's like the bare minimum of
But
what we're asking.
they also have to use at least Qt4 and or at least GTK2, don't they?
So yeah, so the I guess follow-on question was basically I am explicitly blacklisting stuff that's using GTK1 and is it Qt3?
Yeah.
And also things that are using libraries that are known to be insecure, so like LCMS1, which is kind of controversial, but I don't really want to be presenting to the users, use this cool app. We've got screenshots, we've got long descriptions, we've got icons and stuff, but if you use it and you download files from the internet, you're probably going to get pawned. So we only want to show apps that we kind of say these are awesome. I think it's fair to say that if an application is written in GTK1, people don't care much about it. It's probably dead upstream, or should be dead upstream. That be fair? We'll argue later.
But I mean, isn't it also fairly simple to fix that by fixing that I can forward that?
Oh, for sure. So when we first started this, we were blacklisting maybe 50% of apps, and then I spent 2 weeks of evenings going through the different packages in Fedora. Things like, rather than installing the 32x32 icon, install the 64x64 version, which looks better in no shell anyway. But it's basically a packaging. It wasn't important when the package was reviewed, say, 10 years ago,
If fixing an icon is trivial, but porting to newer libraries is not.
Sure,
doable, right?
So the question is, it's very hard to port to a new library, but I don't think I can think of. I think of one application which is blocked from GTK1, and that's the original version of XMS, which isn't maintained upstream. I don't think anyone uses. Probably, I'd argue, probably shouldn't be in Fedora because it's totally unmaintained. The libraries it's using are completely unmaintained. So I guess maybe the policy decision should have come from FESCO. Maybe we should have talked about it, but I'd rather do it and kind of ask for forgiveness rather than asking for permission and then never doing it until F25. So yeah, my bad, I guess. Anyone else? No? Well, thank you very much for listening, and yeah, talk to you all soon.